Ja, god eftermiddag allesammans. Varmt välkomna hit till Timbro. Jag heter Karin Svanberg Sjövall, jag är VD här. Och vi har ju ett lite ovanligt tema för seminariet idag. Sedan tankesmedjan Frivärd startades så har ju Timbro ägnat sig mindre åt utrikespolitik än vad vi gjort tidigare. Men idag gör vi ett undantag och det beror på att det finns ett antal exceptionella omständigheter. Ett är förstås att detta är ett samarbete som vi har tillsammans med ISAIP och Fredrik Eriksson. Och det andra handlar om att vi har en ovanligt intressant internationell gäst som vi inte kunde låta bli att släppa in här när vi hade möjligheten, nämligen Frank Lavin. Jag tänkte inte säga så hemskt mycket mer än så, utan att välkomna er hit, utan att ganska omedelbart ge ordet till Fredrik som kommer att moderera dagens panel.
Tack så mycket för det, Karin. Och från och med detta så tror jag att vi kommer att byta språk och gå över på engelska. So the rest of the seminar is going to be conducted in English, which I hope is fine. So we're welcome here to this event this afternoon on China and the West and the direction of global leadership at a time when international institutions, international rules may be challenged perhaps more than ever in the past decades, and where we've seen the magnificent economic rise of China increasingly being manifested in some new global, perhaps regional ambitions in terms of leadership for China and what we can expect from them in future. We're going to have an enormously qualified panel here this afternoon who's going to enlighten us both about China and its direction, the West and its direction, and what we can expect in terms of collaboration, conflict, and possibly clashes between the West as they may be trying to defend the post-war international order that they were part of creating, and new emerging powers that to some extent at least are offering profound challenges to the way this order works. We're going to start with Frank Lavin, who is a former US ambassador to Singapore, who has spent a good part of his career in different political positions in the United States, starting as political director in the White House and ending between 2005 and 2007 as the Undersecretary for International Trade, or Undersecretary for Commerce for International Trade in the United States. He's shifted between politics and business, and now he runs his own company, which is based in China, in Shanghai. Frank lives in Hong Kong, where he's trying to make a fortune of tapping into the prosperous online commerce market in China. We have two other speakers that will be very known to you. Carl Bildt, the former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Sweden, who now spends his time doing a host of things, including being a think tanker, working for the civil society. Oh, sorry. So you've moved from the non-civil society to the civil society now. Okay, all right, okay, good. Where he co-chairs, among other things, the European Council on Foreign Relations. Lastly but not least, Christina Suncliffe, who is, like me, an economist, who brings a wealth of knowledge about China's economy, not just China's economy, because you've not just covered China as a macroeconomist, but also in previous capacities worked in Swedish government and for Swedish companies watching China and its magnificent development. So a great lineup of speakers, and after we've heard introductions from them, we are going to have a moderate discussion up here, and I will increasingly invite questions from the audience as well. Victor in the back told me that for all of you who can't resist using Twitter and feel compelled to tweet something from the discussion we had this afternoon, please use the hashtag Timbro. Okay. Very good. So, Frank, without much further ado, let me invite you up here and share your thoughts about China, United States, and the West. Where are we going?
Super. Thank you. Thank you very much, Frederick. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. Am I on? Is it projecting, Victor. Good quality. Thank you. It's a delight to be here with Carl Bildt again, who I've had the chance to work with over the year. And thank you to Timbro for hospitality today and a chance to chat about a subject that I've devoted most of my life to in government and in business. And we're here. Let me just lay a few ideas out on the table. I want to talk about China, where's China going, but then I want to wrap up by putting forward some ideas about what this implies for the West, for the US and the EU. And I'll keep most of my remarks on Chinese foreign policy. I mean, the domestic story is a fascinating story as well, but maybe largely outside the discussion today. Here's my starting point. The rise of China is the singular political event of our era, right? And I think it's going to be as consequential in shaping the world as the collapse of the Soviet Union was to the previous generation, right? And this is a combination of two factors that are unfolding. One is the sheer gravitational weight of China, the sheer economic might it has, that there's a new planet in the solar system. So a new planet in the solar system affects the rotation of all other planets. And we can talk more about that phenomenon. But the second distinctive element of the rise of China and Chinese foreign policy is that it is the only major power that is still in the process of defining its international role. In fact, I think regarding China, you can make an even stronger statement to say that throughout Chinese history, China has really never been part of an international state system. So China has extraordinary literature dealing with statecraft and dealing with international relations over thousands of years. It's a well-developed practice in China, but almost without exception, it deals with border state management, right? And when you ask people even today in China, what do you mean by foreign policy? They mean the fellows on our borders, that's it. So there's no broad strategic sense, or there's no history of it, there's no school of IR thought, and to defend China on this point, it never needed a foreign policy. What it needed to do was to keep the foreigners away, right? And that's the end of the story. And indeed, Chinese history ebbs and flows across thousands of years, that it either was the dominant power, and it could display successful statecraft in setting up tributary states or subordinating or subjugating neighbor states, or it was the weaker power, and the border states did precisely the same thing to them. And that is 5,000 years of Chinese history summed up in 30 seconds for you. So this is the first time where China is not only a member of the international state system, but again, because of its economic weight, it's playing a leading role in the system, and it has the capacity to shape the system, right? So it's a new era for China, and it's a new era for all of us. My second point I want to leave you with is then what's the nature of its foreign policy? What's the nature of Chinese policy decision-making? And I'd say China is not a status quo power. It is an ascendant power. So when we look at other great powers and superpowers around the world, I think we'd say, with some exceptions, they are largely status quo powers. There's no other power that has as many territorial claims outstanding as China has. There's no other power that is working through friction, the kind of friction with neighbors that China is doing. So as an ascendant power, I'd say it is not a status quo power, but at the same token, it is not a missionary power. So for people to say, well, is this a new Cold War? Are they oriented toward global geopolitical rivalry? I say there's really nothing in Chinese literature that suggests that. They have reach, they have grasp, they have goals, they have aspirations, but they don't view themselves in global geopolitical competition with other powers, namely the United States. And they don't articulate a global ideology, a global philosophy that would place them in competition. In fact, I find it somewhat reassuring when you look at modern day Chinese literature as to what contributes to their foreign policy formulation. It's overwhelmingly national self-interest, right? We simply look at the world through our particular lens. Is it good for China or not good for China? And you'd say, in a way, that's very reassuring. It's not a bad starting point, right? So there's other elements to it, but that, I think, constitutes the bulk of decision making. And even today, say the overwhelming emphasis of their efforts in foreign policy have to do with border state activity. The third point I want to leave you with is decision-making in China, I think, sometimes poses severe constraints on outcomes for China, and that China is still working through approaches to foreign policy formulation that would give it what I would call better outcomes. I mean, and this is a lecture in itself, but let me give you a few examples. One is that its foreign minister is not in the central committee, right? So I cannot think of a major power that would not have the foreign minister of the country be part of senior level decision making, be at the absolute summit of government decision making, but that's not true in China. And this, I think, represents an effect as well as a cause that we see more so. This phenomenon is true in all nations, but it might be more true in China than other nations, that domestic politics, domestic constituencies drive a lot of decision-making in Chinese foreign policy. Again, that's not intrinsically surprising or intrinsically bad, but it can result in outcomes that aren't the best for China or the best for other parties as well. I'll give you another example that Western models of government get to policy formulation through open debate and open discussion, and we believe this gives us a better outcome. China's made this transition from a Marxist economy to a market economy, but they've not made any meaningful transition in political arrangement domestically. It's still very much a Leninist system. You can call it, if you want to be a little more polite, perhaps a Confucian system. But the point is, it is a top-down system where you do not get to a policy decision on the basis of open discussion. You get to a policy decision on the basis of studying the issue and then promulgating the discussion. So, for example, when China discusses its military budget or weapons acquisition or forced deployment activity, there's no discussion on these matters. There's no discussion of cost benefit. There's no discussion of what kind of military posture we need, what kind of security enhances the best. It's very much a closed system, right? And so we look at several decades of defense expenditures outpacing GDP growth, and GDP growth being among the highest in the world, we say cumulatively there's been quite an extraordinary military buildup. Look, again, some of this is to be expected because when a country's climbing out of poverty, they're going to try to modernize their military. But the question that one would naturally raise as well, to what extent, or at what point does cost benefit come into play, and how big a military do you need, what's the point of it, what's your doctrine in any event. And you simply won't find that kind of discussion in China. Indeed, the Central Military Commission, which administers military, is allowed to set its own budget. So the military, I believe, is certainly among the major powers, the Chinese military is the only military in the world that establishes its own budget, right? So you say not only is there no parliamentary oversight, there's no administrative or executive branch oversight with that. So, so no surprise what we have in front of us. I'll give you a third example that I know holds true pretty rigorously for the U.S. military, and I suspect it holds true for NATO members, and I suspect Sweden as well, which is to say this. If you aspire to be a flag officer in the U.S. military, to be a general or an admiral, you cannot attain that post unless you meet two very important requirements. These are informal requirements, but you'll see this across the board. One, you must have a graduate degree, and two, you must have achieved service overseas. You must have done some tour of duty outside the United States. And if you don't have either of those, you really can't be considered for a senior command, which makes a lot of sense. I suspect Sweden is very much in the same boat, and across NATO you see something like that. It's rather the opposite in China. In fact, China, I talk about the foreign ministry now, but China foreign ministry promulgated a requirement last year that if you received a graduate degree outside of China, you may not enter the diplomatic corps, China. So you have a rather insular setup, which again, I just don't think gives you eventually the best outcomes. So what this tells you is that China government decision-making places an enormous premium on internal cohesion, right? Rather than let's have an open discussion or an open debate or even an argument about what the right posture is. Let's not do that, right? And so in fact, what I see in decision-making is not only do you get top-down promulgation, but then you even in the terms of government decision making, you get an amplification effect, meaning that if an order comes through the system, mid-tier officials or people who actually have to carry it out have professional incentive to amplify the order regardless of how good or bad it is. This is what I mean about domestic politics, right? The test of policy execution is simply, are you respecting that internal cohesion or not? It is not what is in China's long-term best interest. So you have a little bit of perverse incentives in play. And I think that's what leads us to some outcomes which aren't in China's best interest. And the case in point, which I think has been bubbling along for a number of years, that I think in the US we're most sensitive to, is competing territorial claims in the South China Sea. And we'd say, well, it's no surprise that China's assertive in its claims, and it's no surprise they're building, so to speak, while their people are talking. What to my mind, does come into question with this set of activities is, at what point does this desire to assert oneself in the region have the opposite effect to what was intended? At what point does that display of political and military capacity cause more friction than it helps you with, and what trade-offs are involved? And unfortunately, this is a debate we don't currently see unfolding in China. Look, I think this is going to be a long-term debate with China about how the West is going to connect with China, and what U.S. responsibility is, and what EU responsibility is. Let me offer a few thoughts then in closing about practical steps, what I would recommend. And as Frederick indicated, I'm outside the U.S. government, so just some personal opinions. Look, U.S. policy toward China in the modern era has been characterized by engagement since the Nixon trip to China, prior to which we had a sort of an isolation or containment policy. It's been very much an engagement policy, and I think in general that's been very successful. The high point of which I think has been U.S. support for China's WTO admissions, and on a range of economic and trade and investment issues, you could say China acts as a normal member of the international community, so to speak. So engagement across the board is important. Respect for China's one China policy is important, and I also think we have to have the capacity on core areas of interest where there are disagreements to be able to draw a line and send that signal to China too. And the two core national interests from a U.S. point of view that have come to the forefront in these South China Sea discussions have been the fact that territorial boundaries should not be changed through use of force. So systemic value in respecting territorial boundaries, and secondly, freedom of navigation issues. So those are two core American interests at play at the moment. For the EU, it's a little more challenged, I'd say. One, because EU doesn't have power projection capability in East Asia. In fact, Carl can correct me if I've got this wrong, because I don't really come from a Paul Mills side, but my friends from that area tell me that Japan has a larger surface navy than all of European NATO combined. So Japan plays a role, but NATO doesn't and Europe doesn't on the Paul Mills side set of issues. But there are other things that can be done. My first suggestion to friends in the EU is the number one requirement to engage China is for the EU to get its own economic house in order and get back on a growth track. And if the EU can display capacity for economic growth, I think its reach and connectivity in China will be greatly improved. We were talking with some friends down the street earlier today, and I said, my impression, forgive me if I'm stepping on toes, but my impression is when the EU talks to China now, it's the equivalent of when your unemployed cousin talks to you and says, I have some advice for you. And you say, it just doesn't matter how sound the advice is. The first thing in your mind is, yes, I'm sure, but why don't you get a job? So it's difficult. It's difficult to talk from a position of weakness, if you will. So the first requirement is to get the economy growing. The second comment I would make is that one of the more effective ways of engaging China or taking a step to China is to make sure you are taking equivalent proportional steps to the other centers of activity in the region, to India, to Japan, to Southeast Asia. And in fact, you can paint yourself in a corner diplomatically if you think a bilateral engagement process is going to get you where you want. And China might be much more sensitive to what the EU is doing vis-a-vis Japan and much more inclined to accommodate EU preferences in that context than on a standalone basis. So take a step in other directions in addition to taking a step to China. The third comment I would offer is, in my view, the EU is something like, when we talk about soft power engagement, the EU is something like 2 orders of magnitude underweight, meaning doing probably 1% of what it should do. And because, and I'm not saying we'll take your budget up 100x, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying we really need to rethink. We really need to rethink the model. And I believe the EU soft power model correctly evolved through Central European engagement, where the scale of activity was much, much smaller, familiarity was much, much higher, prospect for connectivity was greater. So the idea of having a scholarship program for 100 kids from Poland was a great idea, and it would be a meaningful impact on Poland. And I would say in the same breath, look, the idea of having 100 kids from China is not a great idea, and it won't have a meaningful impact. I mean, the logic behind it is a great idea. But I would say instead, I think what needs to happen is the top 10 universities of EU need to open up campuses in China and need to get 10,000 students. So that's what I mean by 2 orders of magnitude. You have to stop thinking about, I'm bringing 100 kids in, or I'm doing this with 100. I mean, really, the numbers really have to go up if you want to have an impact. And Sweden could nicely fit into one of the universities and play a role and do something if it wants to do that, right? Last I looked, which was over a year ago, there were something like 200 US universities in Shanghai alone that had programs in Shanghai. But most of those were for the American or the American students who participated in that. They didn't have broad participation in China. Another example is, what does Sweden produce in the Chinese language that goes on Chinese websites, Chinese accessible websites like Youku, the Chinese YouTube, right? So why doesn't Sweden produce the daily 20-minute news feed on the EU, on the European Parliament in Chinese language for Chinese consumption? And would you get 500,000 viewers every day, or 100,000, or 1 million? But you'd get a hell of a lot anyhow. I mean, but the point is you're defining the pace for China's perception and engagement with Europe. So I'm saying take the scale up, look at digital activities. The final point I'll make, which I think is a comment that could easily apply to American political leadership as well as European political leadership, is, if I can use this metaphor, you are no longer the mayor. You are now the prime minister, right? In other words, leadership on this set of issues is going to be critical. And by leadership, I mean being able to operate and invest political capital where there's not immediate return for your polity. And that's enormously hard for American political leadership. I dare say it's hard for European political leadership as well. And what you look at, you have these fellows, not surprisingly, a lot of them say, I'm now the most powerful mayor in the world, and that's how they view their prime ministership, is, all right, there might be good mayors or bad mayors, but they're viewing their job as simply solving the problems of the day. And you have to, my point to the political leadership, again, US is guilty of this, if not more so, is you really have to say, where's the world going to be in 5 years? And what do we need to be working on today so that world 5 years from now, 10 years from now is the kind of world we want? And it is going to require some kind of investment in China and other Asian activity to make sure that 5 years from now we're not trying to play catch up with a China that is ascendant and assertive and doesn't feel a kind of buy into the international system. So I will close my remarks on those comments, and thank you. We'll go to the other speakers and take.
Thank you so much, Frank.
Thank you.
Thanks for that excellent opening of this conference. Plenty of good stuff in there, and we'll return to them later. But let me now invite Christina Sandkleff to come up and join me here, who is going to speak from the perch of economics. And what I forgot to say in the introduction is that you now run your own consultancy. Was previously, of course, with East Capital, where you could find your name and your articles quite a lot in Sweden on China. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. So I think that I will start off by talking about one thing that is like a prerequisite for this entire discussion. Will China actually become the world's largest economy? Is it possible for China? already today, we know that China has passed the US GDP in terms of purchase power parity. This was something that happened late last year, when last year China's GDP was 17.6 trillion US dollars, whereas in the US it was only 17.4 trillion US dollars. But if you look at the nominal terms, you can see that China is still lagging behind because its GDP is only 10.3 trillion US dollars compared to the US, which is at 17.4 trillion dollars. Some Chinese economists state that, in fact, China actually passed the US already some years ago in 2009, because there is such a large share of the Chinese economy which is informal that it's not included in the GDP account. So I think the big question is, will the Chinese economy continue to grow, and when will it surpass the US economy in real terms, in nominal terms? Some research I've seen says that it will happen in the next decade, 2023, 2024, by latest 2030. We have to take into account that the Chinese economic growth has slowed quite a lot the last few years. After starting off their economic reforms in 1978, late 78, China has grown at an average rate of about 10%. Last year, they actually missed their target goal for the GDP growth, which was 7.5%. They only grew by 7.4%. This year, they've set the target to 7%, and the economy is clearly slowing. For this first quarter, the GDP grew only at 7%. So we'll see if they miss it this year again. But does this imply that the Chinese economy will not be able to become the largest economy in the world over the next decades? I think that what we are now witnessing when we see slowing investments in infrastructure and real estate and so on, and different sectors like steel and cement and coal industries being hit, and commodity prices falling on the global markets, that is part of what Chinese economists have been talking for many years about, the restructuring of the Chinese economy, going from an infrastructure and investment-led growth to a consumption-driven growth. And, or to quote what the Chinese leadership said after their Central Economic Work Conference in December, China is going from high economic growth and quantity to medium-high growth with quality and increased efficiency. I think that this change is mainly driven by factors like China's demography. China's surplus labor is now shrinking. They don't have as cheap labor as they had before. Labor is in fact getting more expensive, and the textile industry is moving to Cambodia and Vietnam and Bangladesh and other places. You also have the problem of future energy supply, and how will China handle the environmental crisis that you have there? In fact, I think that securing the energy supply is likely the most important reasons for China's improved relationship with Russia the last years. I think that this is something that we often forget when we talk about China's economic growth potential, because often we think, many economists are very focused on, okay, what is the purchase manager index saying this month? Oh, it's 50.5. Oh, last month it was 50.6. Oh, bad, and the stock exchange is falling. But that is not, I'm trying to look a little bit further, and I think that energy is often forgotten. China has already reached peak oil. There are, for their own internal energy supply, they need to find more oil. That's probably why they're hanging out in South China Sea and talking with, well, fighting with Japan, or not fighting, but having their discussions with the Japanese about Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. I've seen Chinese estimates from oil research institutes saying that by 2017, that is in 2 years, they estimate that there might not be enough oil on the world market for China's demand for oil. That is pretty serious. And I think that China really needs to solve this problem of energy in order to continue to grow. Similarly, the environmental degradation poses a challenge for growth. Is it possible to continue to grow at this speed when the air you breathe every day is equivalent of 60 cigarettes a day, and when the water that comes out of the shower is actually dangerous for you to put on your skin, or that and that people get cancer from all the pollution, and people actually get ill from the pollution? Will China be able to clean up its environment? I hope for the rest of the world that they will be able to do that. I'm not sure if they will. And meanwhile, the Chinese leadership and the Communist Party face other challenges, not least their legitimacy. We had earlier this year the well-known China sinologist, American China expert David Shambaugh, who has previously talked a lot about how adaptive the Chinese Communist Party is to the world and how to adapt itself to the changes within China. But now he was warning that we are seeing that the party is losing power because you see that the elite is leaving the country. You see that there is corruption, the growth is slowing, there is increased political repression, and not all party members believe in the party anymore. And these are problems that the Chinese Communist Party, of course, is very well aware of. And I think that besides from keeping the sustainable economic growth, to avoid falling into the middle income trap, where so many other countries, developing countries, have been stuck in after fast economic growth that has been based on commodity exports and cheap labor. You now see that Xi Jinping has a big anti-corruption campaign, and he's also talking a lot about the China dream and how to realizing the China dream. That's a new mantra. And we also know that after he got into power in 2012, in late 2012, he started a big anti-corruption campaign. And so far, both tigers and flies have been caught, including a former member of the Politburo Standing Committee and several high militaries and other party officials. And some analysts may say that this anti-corruption campaign is really all about Xi Jinping getting rid of his enemies. But you could also see it as an economist. I would also say that it's probably also trying to make people obey him, because in China everybody is corrupt. And if you don't listen to what I'm telling you to do, then you'll get busted for corruption. So you better do what you're instructed to do from Beijing. So does China really want to become the largest economy in the world? Well, you have the Asian version saying that, well, not me, I'm so blah, blah, blah. But I really think that China would really like to get its righteous place back in the world order. Because after all, China, in Chinese, China is Zhongguo, which means the Middle Kingdom. And that says a lot about how China views itself in the world. I think that we can also say that we can note that China has become a lot more assertive globally since 2008 and the financial crisis. But does that mean that China is mature enough in taking on the global leadership? Or do they actually want to become a hegemon, challenging the US? I don't know. I think this is part of the discussion later. But it's something that we need to think about. And I think that one thing, as Frank already stated, the current Chinese leaders, don't have much of a foreign or international experience. Their kids have, because most of their kids go to really prestigious places. Xi Jinping's daughter studied under a taken name at Harvard, for example. But as Frank said, that you're not allowed to have a foreign graduate grade from abroad if you want to work at the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and because then you are probably not seen as being trustworthy. And similar, if you want to become a party leader, you cannot leave the country and go away and come back a couple of years later and think that you can actually enter the party where you were. You have to stay and you have to play around and make sure that your place is secure, and also getting to know the right people. So this means that many of the Chinese leaders are educated in the Chinese version of international politics, where China is pictured as a victim, 100 years of shame and whatever they are calling it. And many of the strategies that they use appear to be taken from ancient classic stories, like from the Warring States, which was 500 BC, Three Kingdoms, Sun Art of War, which is very interesting to read, where deception, intelligence collection, and pretending that you don't want to become an hegemony are central. And this probably works fine within China. It's a little bit like we had the social democratic leaders saying, no, I don't want to become the party leader of the social democrats. And then suddenly you become the party leader. So it works fine in China where people are brought up with a similar stories and education. But when you go international, this creates a problem. So for example, if you talk about the Diaoyu Senkaku Island dispute between Japan and China, China says that they are ours because we saw them. We were on a boat and we went past them during the Ming Dynasty, and they're on our maps. And they have loads of other things on their maps, as we were told before. So if they start to take back their tribute states, there will be many problems in the world. And according to the Japanese, these islands, they belong to Japan because they actually went there in the late 19th century. There was nobody there. They put a flag up. Nobody said, oh, hey, what are you doing? It's our islands. Nobody complained about this. It wasn't until the early or late 1960s or early 1970s that China started to complain. And this was only after someone had made a geological survey and found that there could be a lot of gas and oil in these areas. Then suddenly these islands were Chinese. End of story. And this is a way you can see that the Chinese definitions of sovereignty clashes with international law from the Western civilization. Will China become more westernized? I think that when you travel to China and its big city, it's very easy to think that China is very Western. It's easy to say, like Göran Persson said, that this is what you see, what political stability can do for a country, which I know that any minister that has gone to China afterwards say, never say that again. And I know the journalists are always asking, don't you think political stability is good for economic growth? But it's easy to fall for the impressions and see all the modern skyscrapers and so on. And the Chinese, they come to Europe and they think, poor people, they're living in old houses, really old houses from the 18th century or 19th century, poor people. But I think that we should also bear in mind that China is China. China is not the West, even if they would like us to think so. And I think also that the current Chinese leaders, due to their lack of experience of international living abroad, they don't want China to be anything but China. They don't want to. There are, of course, people in China who would like to see China democratize, having freedom of speech and so on. But at the moment, those are not the people in charge. Because currently China is run by the Communist Party, which is protected by the PLA to stay in power. And the party has always precedence over the civil administration in China. So when Xi Jinping goes abroad, we all see him as the president of China. Whereas in China, he's actually the general secretary of the Communist Party. And these are two ways of seeing the same thing. And you can also see that when it comes to foreign policy, that there are other actors that are influencing foreign policies, like the state-owned enterprises, especially within oil and gas, fisheries, the PLA, local governments. Did you, by any chance, know that Jiangsu province actually has its own they have their own representative office here in Stockholm. And they've had it for many years. And sometimes it appears that the netizens are actually driving China's policies towards Japan. It's also important to bear in mind when we encounter China globally, especially in international organizations, that when China talks about human rights or that we need to fight cyber crimes, they're not talking about the same things as we do. Cybercrime in China is, for example, when you write something bad about Xi Jinping or his family, or try to spread the word that Wen Jiabao's family actually managed to get $2.3 billion in fortune while he was in power. That's something that is a cyber crime in China. Human rights includes having housing and food on your table. End of story. China claims that they want more multilateralism in international politics. And they've founded several multilateral organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, and now the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. But are these organizations really threats to our Western organizations? I think we will talk more about that later on, right? But you could see that, for example, the infrastructure investment bank, they have 100 billion US dollars, but the entire East Asian infrastructure need is 1 trillion, according to McKinsey. So maybe it's a good thing that they are actually there. I think we also need to remember that China is changing, even if it's changing slowly within its borders and outside China, especially when it comes to state-owned enterprises or enterprises going abroad, investing abroad, and they suddenly encounter protests in Burma when they're trying to build a big dam, which no problem before, but now suddenly people are saying like, hey, you're infringing on this is not good, and and there are demonstrations, and the Chinese go like, why don't you just shoot the guys or whatever, or just get rid of them? And then they realize that we can't do those things. We actually have to learn how to act internationally. We need to learn how to act globally. We need to respect these things that are actually laws in other countries. So in this case, the dam was actually never built. I think that the best way of handling China internationally is to know China better. Know your Chinese history. Always think twice when China is acting or saying something. Are they saying what they are saying to you because this is what they want you to think that they think? Or are they saying something just because they want to please you? For example, just one easy, simple example is Pippi Longstocking. She's said to be very popular in China. There are Chinese saying, oh yes, she's so popular. But is she really popular? She's fighting the police. She's behaving very rude towards adults. Maybe actually in China, Tommy and Annika are the ones who are the role models, for example. So I think that my conclusion is that it's important to know China and Chinese history. You should never be naive and believe everything they say. We need to prepare for a communist China becoming the world's largest economy. What will it mean for the US and the EU and the West? What should we expect? Will it become a hegemon challenging the West? And we should also prepare for what happens if the Communist Party loses power. Will China become a democracy, or will it become a new Singapore or a new Syria? I think we all need to have a China strategy and think about what would happen.
Thank you so much, Christina, for very good remarks. We are most certainly going to come back to some of the issues that you raised. Both you and Frank mentioned this habit of distrusting your own citizens that have gained an education abroad, which reminds me about an episode from Yes, Prime Minister, when Jim Hacker, who is the Prime Minister, is about to appoint a new foreign minister, and he appoints someone, and someone says, but look, he can't speak in a foreign language. No, that's right. He hates foreigners. Yes, that's right. That's exactly the point why he's appointed as foreign minister. On that note, let me invite up the former foreign minister. No.
I have a couple of stories from Yes Minister as well.
Okay. Well, let me just say before we start, Carl, that I mean, Carl is, well, I'm not going to talk about Yes Prime Minister, but someone who, in your former tenure, made those investments also that Frank was talking about in long-term relationships with China, not just by developing an expertise and becoming a big name in discussions about China, but setting up different things like the Stockholm China Forum and trying to find ways and means in order to engage in a long-term dialogue with important Chinese stakeholders. So the floor is yours, Carl.
Thanks. Or that, to be quite honest, started as an attempt to set up a dialogue across the Atlantic. Because what we suddenly saw, and that was X numbers of years ago, was that perspective on Chinese development were extremely different in Washington and in Europe. And that led to policy clashes that affected the transatlantic relationship. So we saw that in order to manage the transatlantic relationship, we need to have more of sort of consensus nearly on China over the Atlantic. And then that developed into, after a while, bringing in the Chinese and starting to engage with them. And when that started X numbers of years ago, I think it was quite interesting, because when we first brought Chinese in, it was a particularly unrewarding experience, because they had nothing of interest whatsoever to say. But during the last few years, we have had different Chinese voices. China is changing from that point of view, although sometimes rather bizarre. I vividly remember a time, whenever that could have been, a year and a half ago, when we had a session in Beijing, extremely interesting, vivid discussions, interesting things being said, including by the Chinese. And at the end of the session, one of the Chinese #1 representatives stood up and said that he wanted to deliver a message. And the message was that everything that has been said during these 2 days in Beijing that are not in accordance with the policy guidelines of the 18th Party Congress have never been said. To which we said, okay, fine, that's the way it is. So they both have this, they want to engage to a certain extent, but as said, the party line is the party line, and you're not able to or not allowed to deviate. I can agree with everything's been said. I try to stay away from some of the domestic aspects, but I mean the environmental aspect I think should be covered. Those of you who've been to Beijing or even Shanghai these days recently knows that the only thing that you need to care about is this P2M or whatever. What is it called?
Parts per million?
Yeah, quite. I mean, you have to look at the measure every day.
Right,
Or-
right.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Yeah, the particles in there.
Right.
We measure it in Stockholm as well, by the way, but
Right.
no one cares because it has no. But that is really deadly, more or less, and becoming sort of a truly a political issue. Then starting with, since I'm going to restrict myself more to the external aspects of it, is the race for global leadership. Starting with reinforcing Frank's point, or I think you made it as well, that China has really never been part of an international system. Our Westphalian system, which are sort of nation states that are interacting within a balance of power structure and international system, is alien to the historical experience of China. They've been the Middle Kingdom. They manage the neighborhood to make certain that the neighborhood behaves, and they keep the barbarians away, and they build the walls or whatever they do. That's foreign relationship to them. That's been the case historically. And that is also reflected in that sort of striking fact that Frank unfortunately alluded to, and that is the lack of regard for foreign ministers. In the sense, jokingly, that in most countries, I mean, the foreign minister would be number 3, 4, 5, or something like that in the protocol or importance or whatever. In China, I think he would be between 40 and 50 on the list. And the Ministry for Foreign Affairs is really an office for talking to foreigners. It doesn't really formulate foreign policy. It doesn't execute foreign policy. It talks to foreigners. And that is something that you need to do. But whether it is something that is of key importance is debatable. The decision-making machinery, which is driven, as Frank said, primarily by different domestic considerations, is extremely intransparent. If you were to ask, where is the office of the Prime Minister? In most countries of the world, you know where the office of the Prime Minister is. I don't think I know where the office of the Prime Minister is in Beijing. And that's a fairly simple fact that is not normally that secret in most countries. And the government, which we consider in most countries to be important, is not of any importance whatsoever in China. It is run by these small and large so-called leading groups and essentially linked into party machineries where we have virtually no insight whatsoever. It's been changing slightly, but not much. So it is the Middle Kingdom. It is a party-run state. It has its own outlook. It's driven mainly by its own development needs, but of course increasingly becoming, gradually moving towards perhaps the biggest economy of the world. It has an important foreign dimension to all of its policies. And the rise of China in that respect in the international system is a mega change of enormous importance. It's rather like if you compare it to, if you believe in that, the melting of the polar ice. You don't see very much of it on a day-to-day or on a year-to-year basis. But when all of it is melted, it's going to change everything everywhere. It is of that global magnitude. So then it's a question is, what do we do with it? And what should be our attitude and what is going to be our strategy? There's this famous phrase from some years ago, Bob Sulik, when he was, I think he was USTR at the time, who coined the phrase that we should aim at making China what he called a responsible stakeholder. And that was the catchphrase for all Western policy towards China for quite some time. I don't think that applies any longer. I don't think the Chinese want to see themselves as responsible stakeholders, because that implies that they will take responsibility for a system that they have not been part of shaping off. I don't think either, to take the contrary possible position, the theme of this debate, that there's a race for global leadership. I don't think they want to be global leaders. I don't think they are prepared to be global leaders, at least within this generation, so to say. I think it's somewhere in between, that perhaps they see it as being able to gradually reshape the international system, and it could be very gradually indeed. But indeed, reshaping, because I don't think the international system has been done by them, is entirely appropriate for them, and needs to be reshaped over time. But they are not revolutionary, it's not going to be a fast thing, but gradually reshape the international system. How is that then happening? Well, you can see upon the different aspects of China acting externally that we see. From the US point of view, and Frank said you've never been on the pulp mill side, but most Americans have. And most Americans are, of course, obsessed with that particular aspect of it, which is the military dimension of what the Chinese are doing. And there was just, I think 2 weeks ago, the Pentagon published its annual or semi-annual, fairly extensive report detailing their knowledge of the development of the Chinese military structures. And that is indeed, as was pointed out, impressive. If you growth rates have been going down 6-7% as we speak, I think, but they still keep military expenditure growth at 10, 12, 13 or whatever, difficult to know exactly, but it's well above 10%, the increase in military spending. And if you then extrapolate the trends, you find that 20, 30 or 35 or whatever, depending on the assumptions that you make, the Chinese will spend as much or more on military things as the Americans do. And at the moment, exaggerating only slightly, the Americans are spending 50% of all military spending that is there in the world. If this were to happen, it is of course a very major change. Then it takes quite some time to translate military spending into military capabilities. You can allocate money to building an aircraft carrier, but starting to operate an aircraft carrier, the Russians have been trying now for 25 years, and it's still not properly operating, the only aircraft carrier they have, but sooner or later, and the Chinese take a long perspective, these things will happen. And there are points of conflict or points of possible confrontations. The Chinese have a tradition of using military power. They did it in Korea, they did it in Vietnam. They've been fairly assertive on a couple of minor things, but worth noting towards Myanmar, Burma recently. The Indians would always remind you about 1962 and some of the unsolved issues that are up there, up in the Himalayas. They're not risk-taking, but they have a tradition of using military power to remind the neighborhood of where the real power is. Teach them a lesson, do it fast, do it hard, and then withdraw. This, of course, affects the US, and it affects us in an indirect way. Because I believe that the US military spending, which is going to be under pressure anyhow, will be under even more pressure to balance the Chinese in East Asia. I don't think it's going to be much elsewhere, it's going to be East Asia. But it's going to be demanding enough to pour sufficient resources into that part of the world to balance Chinese spending, and that's our part of the story. That's going to restrict the ability of the Americans, whatever they say, to commit military forces to Europe or to other parts of the world, because balancing China is going to be sufficiently demanding. We now see two Asias developing. One is really a security Asia, where America is still the dominating power. Everyone wants the Americans there. The Australians want special forces in Darwin, the Singapore wants literal combat ships in Singapore, the Koreans have the 8th Army, the Japanese have everything, Guam is increasingly important, Okinawa is still there. All of these things, and ballistic missile defense is one of the big issues at the moment. Lots of money coming into that. Everyone wants to have the Americans there. But the other Asia, which is not the security Asia, is of course the economic Asia. Because every single one of these nations that are depending on their security for the Americans have China as the by far #1 trading partner. And accordingly, the economic relationship is becoming more and more important, and the tension between the two is of course pronounced. What the Chinese do, apart from the military thing, which I think is going to be important, demanding, pressuring the Americans, will be restricted to that part of the world, is of course what they do in terms of geoeconomics and the importance of that. Prime Minister Li Keqiang is, as we speak, in Brazil. And Brazil is a country where they have been investing, I think, if I got the figures right, they've been investing $18 billion so far, and he's bringing investments in the order of $50 billion to Brazil. Already now 18% of the trade, foreign trade of Brazil is with China. And one of the projects that he's coming with is to build a railroad from the Atlantic coast through the Amazon, over the Andes to the Pacific Ocean. Quite a project, to put it mildly. But that is, of course, also driven by the Chinese need to get not only the raw materials, but also the food that is going to be necessary in order to feed this slightly declining, but still billion-strong population they're having. And all of this is expanding their activities of this sort. It's not only the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank that's been discussed quite a lot, but also the One Belt, One Road, which is the topic of conversation across most of Asia these days, to have what they call sort of one road, one Silk Road from China to Europe, and build a lot of infrastructure along that, and one belt, which is the maritime version of it, which of course worries the Indians. They're going to be surrounded by one belt and one road eventually if this comes. Huge amounts of money to build enormous amount of infrastructure, to be able to supply the Chinese economy with raw materials and energy, but also connect with growing Asia and Europe, which might not be growing that much, but is still a source of quite a lot of technology and other things. And this will gradually have its impact, no question about that. A lot of that also, if you extend that, as a matter of fact, it ends up in our part of the world. If you're going to build railroads that are going to be very effective, they end up, the most rational way is to build them, they end up by the Baltic Sea. Or for the simple reason that then you run on that narrow gauge Russian system, and they don't have to, or sort of the broader, you don't have to change to the old Western European system. And then you end up with the port structures that is there in the old Russian imperial parts, which includes Finland, by the way, the harbors of the Baltic states of Finland, and that is going to be the most rational endpoint for quite a lot of these infrastructure investments if they come about. Third aspect, which I should just mention, which is increasingly important, is the cyber aspect. China is among the two major cyber-conscious nations in the world. The other one being the United States, where these things are big. But if we talk about these leading groups that they have, Xi Jinping is head of the leading group on internet. I don't think that happens, not even in the United States, that the supreme leader is in charge of the group that actually designs cyber and internet policies. And that's important for two reasons. First, the security aspects. They want to secure the information space inside China for all sorts of reasons. That has to do with domestic stability. But then the tension is, of course, that they know that this is also extremely important for the global expansion of the Chinese economy. The biggest IPO ever in the history of the world and in the history of New York Stock Exchange was the Alibaba, which is one of the most expansive companies in the world, which just acquired a Swedish board member, by the way, recently. And you have the WeChats and whatever. They're extremely sophisticated, extremely good in cyber business. And the tension between the security requirement, the external economic expansion, and now what they call the Internet Plus, they see the future of manufacturing as driven by the internet. They are very determined to shape also the way in which the global net is managed and run. And that is quite a both sophisticated and important challenge to what the West has been able to achieve and what the West wants to achieve. Finally, just to make 2 remarks, which are obvious and have already been made. The first is that we in the West, Americans and Swedes and whatever, we tend to be rather short term. Americans in particular, I mean, they if there's a problem on television news one evening, they want to have the solution the next evening, and they believe that solutions are available to everything fairly fast. Chinese, they don't expect anything to be sorted out by next evening. They don't necessarily expect things to be sorted out at all. They expect things to be managed over a prolonged period of time. And at the moment, if you read what they say, they talk about sort of the 2 years are, I think it's 2021, I think it's the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party, and 2049, which is the 100 years since the foundation of the People's Republic. I mean, who discusses Swedish politics in terms of 2021 or 2049 or even US politics? We don't do that, but they do it. They are very long term. I think the most important or interesting visit I ever paid in China was when I went to a small town called Khufu, where most of you haven't been for obvious reasons, and where few people go. Chinese is the birthplace of Confucius, and everything is holy in that particular town. And where you see that even now the latest part of the family is in Taiwan, but there's been 80 generations since Confucius, 2,000 years, and they have record of everything. And every member of the Confucius, not every member of the Confucius family, but by now there are roughly 2 million of them, but the direct descendants of Confucius are all buried there. And the temples there dedicated to him are the second largest in China, next to the Forbidden City in Beijing. There you see the continuity that is there in Chinese thinking in a way that we are not used to. The big question in terms of going back to geopolitics is, of course, where is this going to end? From the American perspective, or perspective very much of the American debate, will there be war with China? And the parallel is, of course, the rise of Germany that eventually led to a major military confrontation. You might have read Henry Kissinger's book on China, and he's probably the American politician who's been engaged most with China in modern times. And he has this thick book, and the last chapter tries to give an answer to that particular question. He starts with quoting the famous memo that was written, I think, in the 1890s by a British diplomat, saying that the rise of Germany will sooner or later, whatever will do, lead us into a major war, because there's no other solution. And then he asks himself, is this what's going to happen with China? And even Henry Kissinger can't arrive at a conclusive answer to that particular question. At Harvard University, they have now studied 500 years of experience of the rise of different countries. I mean, they started with the famous Sparta versus Athens thing, as you know, and they have studied 16 different cases of the international system being sort of fundamentally altered by the rise of another power. And in 12 of these 16 cases, historically, it has resulted in war. Does that mean that war is unavoidable? No, it doesn't. But it does mean that the change in the international system, very gradually, over a prolonged period of time, is going to be very substantial, and if not properly managed, might even lead to military confrontations. And there are some points where this could happen, but I leave that for the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carl. And why don't all of you, of the speakers, come up here and join us? Well, many thanks to all three of you for excellent introductions, raising many points. So here's how, I mean, thinking about the sort of challenges presented by a new ascending power to existing systems where they may lead to war in future, we don't know. Global wars or regional wars. But if we sort of put that sort of eventuality on the side and think about stresses in the system right now, which is perhaps not about immediate military conflicts, at least not between China and the West, but at the same time we can see a shift from a period when sort of the economic map of the world was pretty similar to the political map of the world, in the sense that strong economic power in the West, strong economic growth in the West, strong political leadership, political aspiration for leadership in the world coming from the West, strong outward orientation, especially from America in the post-war era, leading to many different ambitions and entanglements in other parts of the world. But now we don't really have that sort of similarity between the two maps anymore, in the sense that it's perfectly obvious that the economic activity in the world is not in the West. It happens in especially the Asia-Pacific region, and not the American part of the Asia-Pacific region. But at the same time, the rules institutions that we have been trying to manage in the post-war era, of course in a very imperfect way, everything from our belief in market economic institutions for economic policy, our rules for how we do with current account, currency management issues in the IMF, trade in the WTO, with maritime issues, with how we're trying to deal with migration, with human rights, etc. That political map doesn't really fit with the economic map anymore. So my question then becomes, where do we find ourselves in this process right now? Is this separation between them going to become even stronger, which we expect, given the fact that China is about to expand its economy faster than the West in future? What does it mean for our management of these institutions? Are we going to resign from these global institutions? Says, in order to accommodate China, we need to change. We can't uphold these institutions and rules anymore because they simply don't fit with what China wants. What do you say, Frank?
Thank you, Frederick. Am I on, Victor? Good. Thank you. Let me take your comment and key off of one of Carl's, thank you, excellent comments. Look, there's an enormous challenge to the international system with the rise of a country magnitude of China. And there's challenges, there's also some bits of good news. One bit of good news is that leadership is keenly aware of what you articulated. It doesn't mean they have the management capacity to address the problem directly, but it means they are very sensitive to provocative actions that challenge directly the international system. And they will routinely invoke the example of Putin as a fellow who's completely mishandled his international role, right? And so that's sort of the good news. They say, we don't want to be there. The bad news is they lack self-awareness at times of how sensitive other countries can be when they do assert themselves in a way they don't fully understand, and they can be thin-skinned. Their ability to process information and work it through their system and to think through postures, I think, is just limited. And the key gap we see in China that I don't think we see in most Western countries is this gap between narrow self-interest and enlightened self-interest. And we would say narrow self-interest is simply an assertion of a country's point of view. Use of power, use of whatever tools you have to assert your point of view. You're now better off because you've promoted your self-interest. But enlightened self-interest would say, well, look, don't always do that. Don't always do this. There can be cost to that as well as benefits to that. And if you alarm your neighbors, that's a cost. And by the way, the classical international relations theory would tell us that if you are the ascendant power, you should always defer issues and problem friction because you're going to have a stronger hand 10 years from now, 20 years from now. So don't try to accelerate any controversial issues. But they have a huge gap between those two, between narrow self-interest and enlightened self-interest. And this is, I think, the unfortunate part where domestic politics, domestic activity in China comes into play, that it is very difficult, I would say it is more or less impossible for someone in the Chinese system to say internally, look, don't push this issue, or let the other country have their way. There's no advantage in us pushing this issue right now. The core example here is the contested islands with Japan, the Senkaku Diaoyutai Islands. If we were in the Chinese leadership 10 years ago, looking at what we could see, we would say there's only one geopolitical requirement for Chinese dominance in the region. There's only one thing we have to do in order to have this era be our era. We need to attenuate the US-Japan security alliance. If we do that, that is just a question of timing, right? So we need to do what we can to weaken that. And we say, don't worry about it, because US has budget pressures, Japan has demographic considerations, and there's always a bit of anti-Americanism. Don't worry, it's on a natural downward trajectory. We don't have to, we just watch it fade, right? And instead, they orchestrated this enormous series of confrontations over these islands, and it electrified the Japanese government and the Japanese population. It got the US quite alarmed as well. It was largely gratuitous, and you've got a very strong political consensus now in both governments to say, we need to do what we can to strengthen this alliance, improve it, increase it, and so forth. So through some, chest-thumping activities that clearly had domestic payoff in China, I think, considerably weakened its own strategic posture in the region. So the point is, on the one hand, they have, I think, self-awareness to the issues Carl articulated, but on the other hand, they have, I think, a limited management capability to see those through.
Although as a detail, the Chinese version of what happened there is a different one.
Sure.
They might even have a point.
Sure.
In the sense that the issue was there. No one really cared about these islands. No one had heard of them for a long time. And suddenly we had the mayor of Tokyo buying the territory, which he did in order to prevent some loony from doing things. And when that happened, the Chinese are saying we had to react, because so it was something that got out of hand to some extent.
No, I think it's a fair point.
But then it escalated.
It was a domestic issue in Japan as well.
Yes.
But what I'm saying is, if you had reasonable, look, we don't have these sets of issues in the European context, except for Mr. Putin. But I mean, in general, you don't have these set of issues, right?
We had an issue with Denmark 20 years ago.
Well, those bastards, those, we'll have a separate seminar on there. Right? I have had it with them as well.
Yeah, quite upset.
Okay.
Yeah,
So-
I think it's really interesting, but because I agree with both of you, I think that we also need to bear in mind that some of the policies that China has been pushing forward, for example, this Japanese, the Senkaku Islands, is you solve the easy stuff first. The things that is easy to solve, you solve. The problems that are hard, you leave it for future generations and hope for the best. But then this Japanese incident came, and they totally couldn't help themselves but go.
But isn't that just one example of a broader development where we've seen a China accelerating its ascension in global politics rather than deferring issues to the future, where they're going, largely been irritating, if not, they've been irritating the neighbors, if not making them angry, and making them very wary about what China is going to be in future. Isn't that the sort of China we've seen in the past 5 years?
Yeah, and I think that's the case. To some extent, I think it's unavoidable, because when the economy is growing and the country is growing, it by itself has this particular effect. I mean, they need, as we pointed out, they need the raw materials. They need to import a huge amount of food. They need the energy, and the energy is going to come from the Middle East. So they have an interest suddenly in the maritime routes. They have an interest in building pipelines down to the Indian Ocean through Myanmar. They have an interest in the Karakoram Highway down to Pakistan and the port that they are with great difficulties building there. They have an interest in, which I can understand, but makes the Indians go absolutely ballistic, in building power stations because that controls the water. And if it controls the water of the Brahmaputra and the water of the Ganges, that's the end of India. In the Indian perception. So the fact that they are growing, that their growing needs is having an impact on the region that triggers these particular things. And I think they try to take it easy, but they don't, as Frank said, they don't succeed.
Yeah.
I mean, and they're very long term. Look at their problems with India. I mean, we focus quite a lot on the South China Sea and Japan, but look at the problems with India. I mean, the border conflict which led to war in 1962 has not been solved. The Chinese still claim territories that the Indians claim and that the Indians have. And for example, when people from India, from those particular regions go to Beijing, they're treated differently because they're seen as coming from Chinese territory, not from Indian territory. And this, of course, makes the Indian, to put it mildly, slightly irritated. And you will say, why do they do this? Because few relationships in Asia are as important to the Chinese long term as a relationship with India. Why do we endanger that? Because of some virtually unpopulated areas up in the Himalayas. But they do, because they take the long-term view of these things.
But what you're saying here, Karl, is basically that taking the broader view of China's outward orientation, it's largely follows its economic interests. So its economic expansions requires energy, it requires maritime routes, it requires access to foreign markets, and consequently they are building a foreign policy to become compatible with that expansion, right?
They want to have a region that is compatible with their interests, which are primarily economic. They want to have a global system which is accommodating their interests. Fair enough, you might say. But it does change the region, it does change the global system gradually over time in a fairly fundamental way, and it leads to different sorts of first irritation and then possible conflict. Then there are some areas which I think are profoundly dangerous and could lead to war fairly fast. That's primarily the Korean Peninsula. But apart from that, I more see these things that grudgingly irritation that could get out of hand. But Korea could explode.
So just following on that note, I'm going to invite the other two speakers very soon as well. But so extrapolating from that view, so 10 years from now, China is going to be the dominant energy importer from the Middle East. It's going to,
Yes.
It is perhaps already.
It is.
But put it at least 10 years from now, are we going to see China which takes a much greater interest in the security arrangement from the Middle East and from other territories where it has a strong economic interest? Will we have representatives of Palestine and from Israel going to Beijing in order to negotiate a new peace agreement in Beijing rather than going to America to do it? So is that the sort of extrapolation we're seeing here, that gradually China's economic expansions will outperform or outcompete the role of America, perhaps the role of the West or Europe in terms of having the sort of gravitational pull in managing their interests?
You have to remember that the core of China's foreign policy is non-interference. So that is why they are so popular in Africa among dictators, because they don't care what is happening inside other countries. And the similar thing is with China. You shouldn't be meddling with what China is doing within its own territory in Tibet or even in Taiwan, for example. And I think that China needs to change its foreign policy if we want to see the Palestinians and the Israelis going to Beijing to negotiate peace, because at the moment they are not. But they are telling everybody that they don't want to have, they don't want to interfere in other countries' internal policies. But then they are affected themselves. Like in Libya, they had to evacuate, and they successfully evacuated 30,000 Chinese citizens that were actually working in Libya. And they took them on big ferries over to Crete, I think, which fortunately was like totally empty, loads of tourist hotels, so you could put them up there and then fly them out back to China. But they managed to do this within a week, and I think they even took some Swedes on their boats back. But this is something that they are learning to. They realize that this. I think they're realizing that this non-interference policy, it can't go on forever. probably have other.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're seeing. Look, first of all, they have very limited appetite for political engagement outside of their core interests. So it's another way of saying what Christina said. They don't view themselves as a global, as I said, that's what I mean, a missionary power or a messianic power. They have no global ideology they're trying to work. And as Carl's right, I think they see value in the international system, but it's loose value or limited value. I mean, they're not going to allocate political capital to improving it, but they're not anarchists. So they have finite appetite for this kind of development. However, their growing economic role, their global economic role, places requirements on them to be more involved, more aware, more thoughtful about out-of-area activity, Africa, South America, and so forth, where historically they've been broadly indifferent. I still don't think it's not driven by policy orientation, but it's just driven by economic reality that they've got people on the ground in these markets. They're very active in UN peacekeeping, so they're growing there, but it's not because of a policy view.
So, Christina, I mean, you often get two very different pictures of China's economy and China's long-term economic development. So on the one hand, you have the optimists who can cite numerous factors suggesting that long-term growth in China will still be, in excess of 5-6%. Potential for growth is pretty high. You have another group saying basically this system is unsustainable and it's going to crash. We don't know when it's going to crash, but it's certainly going to crash. You can look at debt levels in the society or in the Chinese economy. You can look at problems of moving from more of a sort of an investment-driven growth model into another type of growth model. So where do you stand on sort of this big ticket issues on optimistic China or pessimistic China in terms of its economic development?
I think that I'm both optimistic and pessimistic.
Oh.
I think that for the Chinese people and for the world, I hope that it will not crash and become that there will be like civil war or something, which could happen. But I think that there are loads of problems in China. You have everything from the cooked books of the statistics to the indebtedness, and then you have these people saying that China will crash soon, and the coming collapse of China. When was that published? In 2001 or 2000? Still hasn't collapsed. So it's, we have heard it. We have been doing China for a long time. We've heard of these theories, and that's why I'm a little bit skeptic about the China collapse coming. But on the other hand, I also see and hear from Chinese friends that there are more and more people doubting the Communist Party story. I have a friend who's told me that he has there are Chinese economists that are coming to him and telling him that the planned economy, we realize it doesn't work, but I'm stuck in the system. What should I do? And he's almost becoming like a priest father coming for them to tell their this is because they can't really talk to other people about their doubts. And there is definitely things going on in China. So I think that, in my perspective, I think that we need to be prepared for both a successful China and a collapsing China. I think that it's very hard. I'm not so brave. I can say that I believe that in this year, blah blah blah, things will happen. It's very hard to say.
Frank, is your business is going to go bankrupt 10 years from now because there's not going to be online commerce in China anymore?
If I'm still doing this in 10 years, it's a failure. No, we work. All we do is work for Alibaba. Right? We're just feed our engines. We're having a lot of fun. We're going very well. I enjoy working in China. I'm probably a little more optimistic, Christina, but not much more, because we can only evaluate sort of the known. We can only evaluate the world as we see it. And when systems go through very sharp deformations, that's very hard to predict. And the collapse of the Soviet Union being the most recent one, we could all see the system wasn't performing. We could see there were significant problems in the economy, technology, innovation. I mean, the system really had sclerotic elements to it. So, but I did think it was very difficult to predict. I'll say this though: I think it is palpable the degree of alienation in China But I also think domestically there's a very high degree of stability. And one subject we haven't talked on, and how I bridge the gap, is one of the extraordinary political transformations in modern era is the emergence of personal liberty in China over the last 30 years. And so you have, by alienation I mean textbook political science alienation. If we ask people in this room, or if we ask people in a room in China, does the government help you lead a better life? Right? Are you comfortable with the government and government services? Is this very fundamental social contract valid? Right? That the government provides a range of services and activities, protection, and so forth, and you're comfortable with all this, right? I can tell you this: if we asked this question in America, we'd find a significant percent, a minority, but a significant percentage say no. The government's a joke. They take our money. They're idiots. They don't do anything for me, right? Well, you'd find a higher percentage in China saying that, saying, no, these fellows are they're self-serving, they're out for themselves, they're corrupt, I have no say in what they do. And then you ask them the second, so that's the alienation, you ask them the second question, how's your life? They said, my life has never been better. My life has never been better. Materially, economically, it's never been better. Prospects for the future, never better. And also my personal space. Historically in China, I never had any ability to live life on my terms. Now I can do whatever I want in my day-to-day life. Even some of the very sensitive areas historically, like religious activity, are generally, tolerated now. But you can do whatever economic activity you want, whatever social activity you want. So that transition from a totalitarian state that controls all elements of society, where China was through the mid-70s, it was really sort of a North Korea setup, a very regimented, that there wasn't one idea of an NGO or a private activity. Everything was done through front groups or state groups or party groups, right? And now it's gone from a totalitarian to an authoritarian, which is to say, you can do whatever the hell you want in your life, but you may not challenge us. You may not challenge us. And by the way, we can be a bit arbitrary how we define that, right? So I don't even want you signing a petition in Shanghai saying pollution is bad or something, right? That's verboten. But, on your blog, you can say, I think pollution is bad. So I don't even mind you expressing an opinion, but it cannot be part of a political identity or political organization. So, look, I've been with a friend, you can organize a seminar on gay rights in Shanghai. That's okay. But again, you cannot have a march or make a political statement on behalf of gay rights. That is not okay. So that's an extraordinary transformation in 30 years in that society. And I think that gives it a fair amount of stability. Right?
Let me very soon turn to the audience, but I have one perhaps provocative proposition here to make.
Back to Denmark.
Back to Denmark. Norway. So we have Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, we have the BRICS Bank, New Development Bank, we have the One Belt, One Road, etc. So one way of presenting this is basically this. So China is unhappy about existing international institutions. It doesn't get any broader command in the World Bank, in the Asia Development Bank. It gets lambasted by all those Americans in the IMF that wants them to reevaluate their currency. So let's leave it all. I mean, there's no point trying to change these systems. They're never going to accommodate a rising power like China. So we have to create our own systems, and they are going to be competitors to the existing system. We need a system from the viewpoint of China which is going to allow us to access foreign markets we want to access, to export our surplus labor and our own capacity in industry, that to the extent it's possible will have positive foreign policy consequences, in the sense we can encircle India and perhaps other powers of potential threats to us, or threat to our status and authority. We're going to use these banks in order to export more to Latin America. We talk about all those foreign trips by high political leaders in China. What they're really basically saying is that we're going to invest in your country because we have surplus labor and overcapacity in our country. Now we need to get them to another market. So what we're talking about here is really a fairly strong competitive strategy against sort of the Western-oriented institutions and rules we had grown used to in the past.
Should I answer? Yes, you could see it that way. You could also see it in another way, that China sees the need of funding even more infrastructure investments in Asia, and that is why they have set up these, or in Africa or Latin America or Central Asia or wherever, they need to make sure that there are these transportation railways. They have like a very impressive plans for connecting Beijing with Singapore by rail, for example, and even with I think there's 2 days by high-speed train to London from Beijing, for example. Somebody needs to finance that.
But would it be possible for, say, a Japanese company to build that lane with Chinese money?
No.
No, I don't think that. But if you would ask them, they would probably say, yeah, sure.
Yeah. And then you find one element of this $20 billion contract that you give to Japan participants. You say, see, we're being fair. Right.
No, but I don't, going back to a good question, I don't think they will challenge the international system in order to set up another one. I said I think they are in the business of gradually reshaping it to suit their interests. Gradually.
Yeah.
Not too provocatively, or they could misfire, but certainly reshape it, because they consider it rightly so, shaped by the West for the interest of the West, and now they are there, the system should be changed. Then I think the big question, as we said, is where are we in 20 years' time? I mean, were we to be asked the question, where is India going to be in 20, 25 years' time, we would all say it's going to be still be sort of a fairly messy democracy, rule of the law. They need to clean the streets in Delhi somewhat better, plus minus 10%, that would be the prediction. Do the same prediction for China, we would be sort of plus minus 50%. The bandwidth of uncertainty on China is much, much bigger. The domestic stability is there. I would say the environmental issue, if they don't get that one under control, could be, there's a revolutionary potential in that. Because when people see their lives are better, but when they see their children getting sick, because what they consider misuse or mismanagement by the party, they might get slightly angry. So I think they really need to do something about that. That's probably the most explosive issue that they have.
And look, they're going to be victims of their own success. Their fundamental challenge in 10 or 15 years is they're going to have a middle class which is dissatisfied, because middle classes are always dissatisfied, right? And you say, today I'm very happy because I can watch any movie in the world for free, can steal it, and if I want to take French lessons, I can take French lessons. If I want to have a community basketball team, I can do that. If I want to go mountain biking or sing in make a music video, I can do whatever I want. I can run a restaurant, right? And you said that's incredible, because never in life have you been able to do this. But I'm saying the magic of that fades quickly. 15 years from now, you'll say, so what? I've got a bad restaurant, and I've got bad music videos, and I've got bad pollution, and so what are you doing for me now? Right? So it's very hard. Same challenge we have in the West, right? How do you keep government services up with a society that has open-ended aspirations?
And I also think you need to remember that in 15, 20 years' time, the people living in China are people who have not experienced the Cultural Revolution.
Correct.
They have grown up during the economic reforms, and so they have different views. They might not even be aware of the Cultural Revolution.
So we have something very powerful in the West in our social contract. It's primarily process-driven, not results-driven. So we can say to anybody in our societies, look, it's your government. You change it if you don't like it, right? If you have a policy goal, you make it happen, right? You're running it, right? And you have no basis for complaint, right? If whoever won, and they get to do what they want, right? So I go back to China, and Carl speaks here, and that's that, right? But the point is, you don't have that that very fundamental process point in China, and they in China they tend to discount that. They'll tend to say, well, but I'm giving you better outcomes anyhow, right? I mean, look at Europe; it's a disaster. America's not much better. Right? So I'm giving you better outcomes, so you should be happy. You could say that's Leninist, or it's very Confucianist, right? I think that works better with an uneducated population that is just climbing out of poverty, or just coming out of this North Korean prison. And it doesn't work so once people are middle class.
All right, let's take a couple of questions from the audience. Please raise your hand, and I'm going to make a note, and you're going to get the microphone starting down there. Then you.
Hi, my name's Nicole. I'm actually an intern at the Stockholm Free World Forum. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. My question is actually about China's relationship with Vietnam, and how the conflict over the Spratlys and the Paracels, how that security situation, how that security situation has consequences for China's relationship with the West.
Okay, and Victor up here, we'll take the next question.
My name is President Christian Democrats.
You can take the mic.
My assumption is that most Chinese leaders that count are in their 60s or late 50s. Do you see any particular development ahead with slightly younger leaderships? What does a 40-year-old brain in China looks like?
Okay, thank you. And take one more question before we turn to the audience. Down there. Yeah, down there.
Thank you. I have two questions. One concerning China in Brazil, which is a new chapter, because before they centered into Central America, and now a huge investment in Brazil. And the Brazilians are not all that happy. That's why they are looking more towards Europe now and see how the TTIP treaty will take place, and they want to be a share of this. The other one is the military activity with Russian and Chinese troops in the Middle East. How do you interpret this? And does it mean that Russia feeling the chill from the West means that it is leaning more and more towards China, and this pact has been going on between China and Russia? How does it affect us in the north? And Brazil means a lot to me. So please.
Okay.
But besides about the money, I grew up in China, and something they know is to keep the money, but not how to use it. And it is the London Stock Exchange that will take care of the renminbi.
The London Stock Exchange. Yes, indeed. Well, some part of the money. Yes.
They will teach the Chinese how to do it, but they will be in control.
Okay. All right. So why don't you start with you, Carl, on the question about military collaboration between China and Russia, and perhaps if I can add another question to that, which is there a fear that stronger Chinese-Russia relation can exacerbate security arrangement conflicts we have in Europe with Russia?
Not really. I mean, there's a lot of discussion and speculation about that. I wouldn't be too worried. The Russians are very much trying to play the China card. Whether the Chinese are that keen on playing the Russia card is more debatable, because they don't consider Russia to be that significant an actor as Mr. Putin believes. But there are clearly issues where there is same values and same interest, and where they act together in the international stage, but fundamentally not that much. Military cooperation, they have this exercise in the Mediterranean. I don't know the details of it. I saw there was a Chinese supply ship or something like that. It's probably somewhat more than that. But of course, Chinese military capabilities this far away is not too much. What is worrying is that they are starting to operate submarines now and then in the Indian Ocean. Indian Ocean will be more important for them. There was even talk about them sort of trying to establish base areas in Djibouti, where the Japanese are, by the way. And you can see that they want to secure their sea lines of communication at some point in time, also maritime. So we will see more of that. Others are then trying to balance that. The Vietnamese, to take that particular example, we see an element of that. I saw the other day that the 6th submarine that the Vietnamese have ordered from the Russians is now ready for delivery from St. Petersburg. They've been building 6 of them, and they've been testing them in the Baltic for the last few years. That's a fairly substantial submarine fleet that the Vietnamese are investing in. Sophisticated, big Russian-built advanced submarines are coming out of the Baltic to Vietnam, and that is of course not because the Vietnamese are afraid of the Danes, to return to that particular subject, but it's everything to do with China. We see a military build-up in Asia, which is very significant all over, and the Vietnamese-Chinese naval race is clearly there.
So, I mean, Frank, anyone who was politically aware during the 1960s and the Vietnam War, living in America must be extraordinarily surprised to see a lot of Vietnamese people welcoming with open arms the American military back to the country. I mean, what is it all about?
Well, it's realpolitik. I think it's very much to the credit of Vietnam, and I also may say to the United States, to say don't define your future by your past. I mean, have a historical memory, look back, but don't stare. So, you know, remember where you came from, but define your future in current terms, and be pragmatic about it. And Vietnam, I think, has a very clear understanding that the power with which it's had the greatest amount of friction, or the only power with which it's had friction in the last few decades, is China. Also, by the way, if I may say, this might be sensitive for Americans here, but I think they view themselves having a lot of flexibility with the United States because they won the war, right? So they don't have any neuralgia about dealing with the superpowers. They say, we beat you guys, so we can accommodate you on our terms, right? So, all right, fine, let's not be defined in that sense. Look, it's harder for the Philippines in some respects to deal with the Americans because they were a colonial party and they kicked us out. And by the way, to refer to the question on the Paracels, remember, the Paracels were recognized as part of Vietnam, but it was part of South Vietnam. It was RVN. And it was only after the collapse of Vietnam that China said, you know, rather opportunistically, I mean, well, it looks like we're here and no one else is, so they're now ours. But it was very similar to what happened to China Mischief Reef, which again, even in Chinese documents, was recognized as part of sovereign Philippines territory or outside of Chinese sovereign territory. But when the Philippines kicked the United States out, the Chinese went in and said, here we are. So they're, you know, quite opportunistic, and they move, you know, reasonably fast.
May I ask you also to you, Frank, can there be sort of this Eastphalian balance of power perspective that we hear a lot of people talking about now? Can we plausibly see that sort of development with India, Japan, perhaps Australia and some part of it evolve, creating stability, even if America is going to remain a power with strong alliances in that region?
Well, I think you need a U.S. leadership for the near term. There's no other power that can play that balancing role, and I think that's widely accepted in East Asia. But over the long run, I think the answer is yes. I mean, you might have a China that is a bigger economy than the U.S., or at least maybe several decades from now, but has considerable power projection capability in East Asia. The real, I think you put your finger on an outcome, which is balance of power. That to my mind isn't the question. The question is, what will the cost be to get there? So you could say, look, it took Europe a number of centuries and a number of wars and a lot of blood to establish sort of a mature equilibrium and mature powers that countries can connect and communicate and work together, and nobody really thinks about use of force. And there's a very deep institutional structures and so forth. We don't need to be that good in East Asia, but you need to have some kind of understanding and operating mechanisms, and you sure don't want to pay the price that was paid in Europe to get there. So can we get there on a sort of minimizing friction and for all basis to avoid war? That's the question.
Christina, you mentioned in your introduction David Shambaugh and his recent essay on China, and coming back to the question from the gentleman here on sort of the rejuvenation of the China Communist Party. So what we've had here is not just David Shambaugh, who is a very famous political scientist and expert in China, but a host of strong, especially American experts on China, which previously have not been on the alarmistic side of the argument when it comes to China. They've basically taken a view which is that, you know, yeah, problems with the Communist Party, but it's fairly stable. They're going to survive. Now they're giving opposite view, saying, you know, next year, 5 years, and 10 years' time, this party is not going to survive. So what are the sort of the different scenarios that these sort of people, that you and that others are looking at when it comes to the role of the party itself and its standing in China?
Ooh, that's a big question. I think that it's a really tough question because I think David Shambaugh he's really knowledgeable about China, but sometimes I'm wondering if is this what the Chinese want him to think, or is it what is really happening? That's one thing that I've been pondering, because his arguments that the elites are leaving China, well, are they leaving China because they don't believe in the Communist Party, or are they leaving China because they want to secure their financial assets, or are they leaving, like many of my Swedish friends and foreign friends, leaving China because of the pollution? I don't know, and they have been leaving for many years. It's not something that is new. It's a really hard question, because also if you look at previous empires, as we were talking about before, this is something that I know that has been on Chinese television. The end of an empires, and there was a very popular TV show, and it was a documentary, and people were really learning how long can we continue, and so on. And I know that there are people calculating that, well, the Communist Party should actually end its rule within 10 or 20 years, or something like that. It's really hard to be someone who's a future seeing into the future. I don't have those those gifts, unfortunately. But I think that it's important to be aware that there are these threats, and you should prepare. So, for example, if you are a business person, maybe you should not only make friends with the China Communist Party leaders, but you should also look at what are the people in opposition, what are they saying, what are they doing, how can we help them if there is something that we actually like. You have to play, because the Chinese are doing the same thing. When there were uprisings in Burma in 2007, the Chinese were very friendly with the Burmese government at that time, or Burmese dictators at the moment. But they were also talking to the people that were staging the demonstrations and so on. And I think you have to be aware that there could be many outcomes. When it comes to the question that the gentleman here asked about, why don't we see young party officials? Like here in Sweden, we have the Christian Democrat party leader. She's 27 years old. 28, yeah. And Annie Lööf, the Center Party leader, is not much. She's 31 or 30 or something like that. So they're very young. In China, in order to become a top party official, first of all, it seems like you need to be a man. And then you also need to, because there are hardly any women at the top. And then you need to also go through different things. You have to sit in one of these provinces as a party secretary, ruling a province with as many population as European countries. And you need to do all these steps, and then you have to make sure that there are no bad corruption case that is exploding in your face often, and you are often moved around in the country. Sometimes you arrive in places where you realize that you're actually sitting in the middle of a mobster gang, loads of corruption, and the only thing you can do is to just wait for Beijing to move you somewhere else, to hopefully back to Beijing, and then that you want to end up with a horse head in your bed.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, just to build on that, if I may,
Yeah.
I think you're exactly right. I mean, think of it as a military career, right? I mean, you are tested in the system over decades, and you rise step by step over the years, right? And what's not important is how clever are you or how good is your idea. That is significantly less important than your understanding of the system and your respect for the system. And as I said, the supreme value, since they moved away from Marxism or communism as an economic philosophy and also as a historical determinant, since they've abandoned, they've left their religion, right, that the supreme value becomes internal cohesion. So I'd say there is one question on the job interview in China, the Chinese government. There's one question on the interview. It's a 50-year-long interview. But the one question is, are you one of us? And if you're one of us, we move you up. And if you're not, that's it for you, because your first loyalty is to keeping this thing going, right?
And
so,
and do you know the right people?
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Going on that, I mean, we talk about the stability of the system, and we think the system is stable, or we think it's reasonably stable. My impression is that they are far more nervous about the system. That goes back to, Frank said there's far more personal liberty in China today. Yes. You can sit at the dinner. You can sit at the dinner in Beijing or Shanghai and discuss virtually everything in private, with the possible exception of Tiananmen. Still, I mean, if you bring up Tiananmen, any conversation dies because it is dangerous, and the fact that they are not able to talk about that, hardly even in private, shows their nervousness, and that, I think, also is a weakness of the system. When there are aspects of the modern history which most people are reasonably aware of, that you can't even discuss in private, then of course there's a danger for the system, because suddenly that issue explodes the one way or the other.
Right.
And then everything could unravel fairly fast, and they are very nervous about that.
I think it's very hard to measure the resiliency of this system,
Yeah.
right? We know it performs well in good weather, right? It's a very functional system, but you'd say, are you going to have a whole society move in a different direction from government, where that alienation becomes so profound? You know, this is the French Revolution or something, that 30 years from now these people say, these guys are so hopeless, there's no sense even supporting them. I'd be surprised, but it could happen. And the, you know, the trouble with these closed systems, this insularity problem, the fundamental problem is there's no feedback mechanism, there's no adaptive mechanism, right? So you can't, you know, there's a problem when you don't have opposition parties, or even inside your party, you don't have somebody say, that idea is not a good idea, or let's debate it, right? And when you don't have that, when you have this incredible consensus, it is always, you know, I've spent much of my life in trade negotiations, so it was always extraordinary, the degree to which they would promulgate something which we said, look, we can't accept that. And they were quite shocked or surprised. They said, well, why did you? They said, well, we spent 3 years working on this. I say, well, what does that tell you? I mean, you know, you have a system that only talks internally, and it's not always market-oriented, and it doesn't think about political reality with the other party. And so we have to come up with a solution that allows everybody to be happy. But just that's very, very difficult for them it's, as Carl was saying, it's not a foreign ministry that actually wants to listen, engage the other party, and think through, can we come up with a win-win outcome, or I recognize you have your political reality, I have mine. We have to come up with some kind of satisfactory solution so that people can live with the results, right? They're very difficult for them to do that.
Okay, quickly take a few more questions from the audience, starting with you, please.
Sophie Olsen, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I have a question. In the year after the financial crisis, one of the major reasons have been quantitative easing. Sorry, is it not on?
Hold it closer.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So in the years after the financial crisis,
Yeah.
there have been talks about quantitative easing, whereby countries trying to have a cheaper exchange rate and promoting their exports. And we also know, of course, that US have been pressuring China to appreciate their currency. Now with China's increasingly global dominance of the economy, being a top trading party of almost all countries, what are the, say, short-term or long-term views on as China tries to make the renminbi a global currency and even a reserve global currency, that with these countries we have been talking about, that they would sort of try, quotation, monetary warfare, which may come at lesser cost than perhaps military warfare, and which could be also quite disruptive with inflation and so on. So that's one question. And very briefly, I mean, as China moving up the value chain, they have built their economy basically copy, make cheaper, and move to copy and improve. But we never hear what Western leaders are always talking about, innovation. Is that something that you could comment on? Is the Chinese leadership thinking about how we're going to become leaders in innovation for our future growth? Thank you.
Thank you. Quickly there, and I can say China is probably the country who spends most on innovation in the world. So it's, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Peter Linde. I have a quick question. Not being a China expert at all, I wonder how reliable is the official economic figures coming out of China. Basically.
Okay, and lastly, yes, you please.
Hi, my name's Will Langren. I just have a sort of question really for Carl, and something you said, Carl, relating to the melting of the ice, and it's a bit of an obscure question, but I think relevant nonetheless. I would just like your view and the panel's view on China's ambitions for the Arctic. China has self-proclaimed itself as a near-Arctic state, and sort of rich Chinese tycoons seek to purchase large swathes of Norway.
Iceland, I think it was.
Iceland.
But anyhow, they can take
It was
Norway.
Iceland.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought it was parts of near Spitsbergen, but in any case, I would be interested in that. I think perhaps there are opportunities to show China how to achieve a sort of peaceable resolution of sovereign maritime disputes, and perhaps this is an opportunity for greater engagement.
Okay, so let us turn to the panel for a final time, starting with you, Carl, also on this particular question on the Arctic. I mean, aren't we seeing a great replay of sort of the great competition period being played out in Arctic now? China, Russia, America, Canada, Sweden, Norway, all betting for
Denmark.
Denmark, sorry, of course.
Well, don't forget Denmark, because they have got Greenland, which is the biggest single piece of territory up there. So they are a superpower in the Arctic. That should be said. But first, briefly on this economic QE version that they did after 2008. That was, of course, extremely good for the global economy, what they did, no question about that. So we should be thankful for that. I think it was detrimental to the long-term health of the Chinese economy, because it tilted it back to the state-owned enterprises. And at least my reading, but I'm saying this somewhat provocatively to hear your view, my reading is that the reform impetus we had after this third plenum has faded somewhat. And a lot of what we now see, one belt, one road and whatever, this investment thing is a top-down, slightly semi-Soviet approach to economic development that is coming back at the same time as we have, in my opinion, the financial uncertainties coming out of the post-2008. But I'd like your views on that. On the Arctic, why are they interested in the Arctic? For some reasons. One reason is they want to be everywhere. I mean, if you go to, which I highly recommend, if it's still there, what I assume it is, if you go to Beijing, go to this exhibition, which is called The Rise of China, whatever it is, at the National History Museum opposite to the Palace of the Peoples, which is the exhibition which Xi Jinping took the new Politburo till for the first time and said, this is the Chinese dream. And there you see the rise of China from the humiliation of the Opium War through everything, their version. And there's an entire room of Antarctica and Arctic, just because they want to show that they are everywhere. So that's one aspect. They want to be everywhere. Second aspect, they have a substantive interest in what could happen with the Northern Sea route. If that really opens up, it does have implications for, that's a one belt, one road again up there. I think that's going to happen fairly slowly, but a substantive interest. Third substantive interest is that they are, to a certain extent, a near-Arctic nation in terms of climate effect. I mean, if you are in Beijing in the winter, it's pretty Arctic. And north of Beijing is Siberia, which is heavily influenced by the climate of the Arctic. So they are affected, even if they are far south, if you look on the globe. Effect of Arctic development, sort of climatical, is quite substantial. So they have an interest in having research stations and things up there. As for this man buying Icelandic thing, or whatever he's buying at the moment, I took a rather benevolent approach to that. I didn't see too much of sort of mischief. There are all sorts of funny Chinese entrepreneurs buying funny things all over the world at the moment. Some of it pretty bizarre. And I think that was it as well, and I think it faded away. But the important thing which we should press, of course, when it comes to the Arctic is say, hi, you are now members of the Arctic Council. There you see how we regulate maritime areas with the UN Convention Law of the Sea, or rather a combination of the UN Convention Law of the Sea as the legal basis, but the literal states as the stakeholders in the process. If you could apply that particular model to the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and in the future to the Indian Ocean, it's not a bad thing. So from that point of view, there might be a good long-term aspect of dragging the Chinese up to the Arctic as well.
They are very friendly with Iceland. They do have a free trade
They do.
agreement nowadays, and
They do.
the Chinese embassy is the largest embassy on Iceland in Reykjavik. So there is a lot of Chinese interest. They're very interested in thermal energy and so on.
Yeah. So what do you make, Christina, of the argument, which is that China is on an economic track right now where they have been become excessively dependent on fast monetary expansion in order to grow the economies, in the sense that if you want credit growth to maintain at current elevated levels, you need to expand your monetary base very, very fast. So that's why we're seeing they are accelerating and decelerating from time to time, depending on whether growth is going down or inflation is going up. So,
But they are not doing as they could have done. They are now, when they are doing stimulus in China, they are not opening the printing machines for RMB, but they are actually trying to cut the red tape and trying to do other things that doesn't cost that much, because they know that if they start printing the money, then there will be more problems, because they're already stuck with the 30 trillion RMB in local government debt. They don't really know how to solve.
Yep.
I think that it's really interesting, as you said here, that the expansion that they are doing now with the Silk Roads and so on, that they are actually investing in infrastructure. Sometimes I feel like that's the only way they know how to make things grow. They are spending a lot of money on innovation, and it is. I think that they are more innovative than we want to believe, because last year Huawei was actually number one in filing patents, international patents, and ZTE was number two. I think usually they're fighting with each other. And of course you could say that, and I think Ericsson was number 9. And of course you can always say that, well, they are not putting in good patents, but I mean, everybody's putting in patents that are not super good because just for doing it. But I think that there is quite a lot of innovation in China, but the problem is that the Chinese government would prefer the innovation to come from the state-owned enterprises, and that's not where they're going to come from. They're probably going to come from the private enterprises that will start, and they don't have access to financial assets or to loans yet, and that's why they need to change. But yeah, I don't know, time is running out.
Indeed. So lastly, Frank, so they're not going to buy US Treasury bonds anymore? So they can't fund perennial fiscal deficit in the United States. And to add insult to injury, they are very soon going to outcompete the US greenback as reserve currency in the world. Do you believe that?
This is sort of Sophie's question. I think of all of the elements of policy reform, China has historically moved the slowest on currency-related issues. I think they have very limited appetite for. It's been very incremental, step by step. It's always been liberalization, but as slow as possible. So I wouldn't be surprised in the next few years we see greater accommodation of foreign investment in the Shanghai stock market, for example, allowing the investment banks to do more and allowing cross-border investments. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some steps like that. I don't think we get to full convertibility in the next few years, and I think the PBOC be enormously opposed to ideas or suggestions about using the currency for anything other than efficient market activity. It's one of the few economic tools which is purely under the role of central government. So it's another way of looking to Carl and Christina's points about their economic tools are sort of uneven how they use it, but convertibility and monetary policy is theirs. So they're very wary of using it for anything else but for intended purposes. I'm probably a little more cynical than Christina on how far they've gone with microeconomic reform. They need to do it. I just haven't seen that, and it's in all of the speeches. They need to reform the economy. I haven't seen it. but I've seen discussions and promulgation. This ties into Peter's question on econometrics. I'll tell you, the good news about Twitter is there are 100 people asking this question on Twitter who are pretty thoughtful, and I don't follow 100, but I've been looking this week at statistics on electrical consumption in China, which is a great indicator. I saw one this week on beer consumption in China, but I am a little skeptical of that because wine is so popular. So I think you're confusing, affluence or beer purchase with the fact that because of affluence and social, sophistication, actually the wine market is improving faster than the beer market. And the beer market might go negative while the wine market shoots up. But nonetheless, it's good to know on Twitter, you've got guys who give you regular feeds on monthly beer consumption statistics. So my advice is, depending what you're trying to do in China, but there's a lot of information on rail freight carriage and use, which is fantastic. There's a lot of real estate data out there, indexes. So my view is take a look at it. We're only in the consumer goods space. And so we have the incredible advantage of just looking at the raw Alibaba data. Just tell us what's going through that system, tell us what it's priced at. Alibaba leadership tells us, look, the State Statistical Bureau now uses the Alibaba data as their basket of goods for measuring inflation. Well, because why? I'm sure, by the way, my guess is Sweden does it like the US. You send out 100 people with a clipboard and they go to 100 supermarkets and they say milk, eggs, and this is our goods, and we feed it in, we have inflation. You say, oh, all right, that's a reasonably good sort of 1850s system. But now you can look at, 1 million transactions. You can look at 1 million transactions a minute, right? And so you can get incredible amount of refinement on purchases on that. So I am skeptical of the macro data, but there's a lot of great micro data around that can help you in modeling and planning.
But you are bearish on the bear market.
I'm bearish on the bear market.
All right. Thank you so much, Carl, Christina, and Frank, for a very enlightening and joyful afternoon. I think it's been great, and I hope you thought so too, and that you would like to join me in thanking them with a warm applause.
Thank you, Frederick.